Okay, hi everyone. My name's Omri Haven, and I'm the Agrivoltaics Policy and Community Engagement Coordinator for the Clean Energy Research Group at SFU, Simon Fraser University. I see some familiar accounts here, and feel free to turn on your screen if you so choose, but no pressure. I know this is sometimes a bit of a pause in the middle of a workday. This virtual presentation is being hosted on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples here in Vancouver. And we hope that through our work here at CERG, we can advance the cause of reconciliation and decolonization, moving towards energy sovereignty and security for First Nations. And the CERG hosts regular forums on topics related to clean energy, energy justice, and climate change that feature cutting edge research, as is the case for this presentation, from for a wide variety of audiences. We bring together academic rigor and the public sphere through these talks, the working papers we publish online, and through our research initiatives we take up also follow this lead. So without further ado, today's talk is by Dr. Louise Comeau, senior advisor at Re.Climate, which is housed in Carleton University's Center for Climate Change, Communications, and Public Engagement. I believe that Dr. Comeau is beaming in today from the territories of the Wabanaki Confederacy in New Brunswick or in St. John. And Louise specializes in mixed methods research with a focus on social acceptance of climate change policies and the energy transition, especially around electrification. Louise has more than 30 years of experience in climate change policy, communications, and solutions-related advocacy and programming, and holds a doctorate in environmental management focused on environmental ethics and behavior change from the University of New Brunswick. Louise will be presenting her groundbreaking research collaboration with Abacus Data, which recently surveyed over 4,000 Canadians to gain insights on the social acceptance of energy transition technologies and climate change. This just released work builds on previous work undertaken by Dr. Comeau and the team at Re.Climate to provide evidence-based tools and recommendations for climate communicators to advance the green transition. Dr. Comeau is making a special presentation for us covering climate change and social acceptance of wind and transmission projects called Getting to Yes, Climate Change and the Energy Transition. We'll hear from Dr. Comeau for the first 25 minutes, and then I'll engage with her for a few preliminary questions, and then we'll do a bit of a Q&A. For the Q&A, please remember to keep your questions and comments brief so that other people have time, and a reminder that we're recording this session to be posted on our YouTube channel. So with that, I'll hand it over to Louise. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Omri. Now, we didn't even test whether I can share a screen. Let's see how this goes. And indeed, it looks like I can. Thank you, everybody. I am just going to minimize all the things I like to minimize so that I can see my screen. And as Omri said, this is a taste of a quite detailed technical report that we will officially release on March 26th in a webinar that Re.Climate will host. And I've been doing this work for a while. I started it at the Conservation Council of New Brunswick, looking at questions of why projects failed. We saw some real failures in New Brunswick, and I wanted to understand that better. And it has sent me down this path that I'll share with you today. If I can advance my screen, just give me one sec here. There we are. There we go. So I will give you truly, it's a 170-page report. So you're getting the flyby, very much top line results and some of the recommendations, and I'll share with you what comes next. We did indeed do a national survey with Abacus Data, more than 4,200 Canadians in the fall. It included questions around climate change. If you saw our webinar last week, I reported out on some of the general population results. but we also had a deep dive into questions of social acceptance, trust, fairness perceptions, community benefits, and so on. And I also did a population segmentation on what we call the 5 Canadas, which we will report out on in April. Let me just give you a very high level, some of the interesting results from the general kind of perspectives on energy of Canadians. Because of the current national discussions, we asked a question, do you feel more pride about Canada becoming a renewable energy superpower over becoming an oil and gas superpower? And then flip that question the other way. And found quite a strong response of Canadians selecting 70% saying, in fact, renewable energy superpower is where they lean more. That indeed is the case for a majority of residents of all provinces. And in particular, if you look at the bottom of the screen and you look at New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, PEI, and Newfoundland, Labrador, you really see, and we see this consistently throughout our study, Quebec's also very high, that we have quite high results for movement toward renewable energy superpower. But in this presentation, I'm going to focus more not on the climate results, which I provide a link to at the end, but more the social acceptance work. And in this case, I was looking at large-scale wind and transmission. I live in New Brunswick, lots of talk here about Wind West. We had focus groups in Ontario and Nova Scotia, and so those informed the responses. You've seen results like this. There's nothing new particularly, except to say that here I was looking at support for various energy sources, and I was looking at it in a particular kind of way. In this case, you'll see that on the left, I note in bold, energy sources you rely on. So keep that in mind for what's coming next. And solar ranks at top, followed by hydro, then onshore and offshore, wind, gas, transmission, liquefied natural gas, and nuclear. What we see here in terms of provincial support and breakout is that transmission support is highest in Quebec and Alberta. And I mention it because I was surprised to find the support for transmission was as low as it was. And throughout the study, I found it was also a harder sell. We see, and this will come out over and over again, is that Nova Scotia is the most supportive of onshore and offshore wind, outranking every province in the country. This is the highest that support will ever be, and we'll talk about the U curve as I go. But we also asked the question another way. If you look on the right, I asked how people might support, in this case, we're looking at the 3 energy sources of interest in this study, onshore, offshore wind, and transmission. And I asked the question again in terms of where you live, and you see quite a dip. And so we do know from the literature that support for renewable energy technologies does come with conditions, and you see that kind of impact 60% when it's the general idea of power I rely on versus up my street. At 42%, you see the dip from 59 to 42 for offshore and 46 to 35 for transmission. We also wanted to know what exposure levels were like and the effect exposure has on people's support for these particular technologies and transmission infrastructure. And overall, 22% of Canadians say they are exposed either through discussions, proposals, or built projects. When we asked in a follow-on question, what kind of exposure, we see 42% say discussed, 30% say proposed, and 28% say built when it comes to wind, and 37, 29, 34 for transmission. Now, given that pretty much everybody is exposed to transmission, it's just one of those things that disappears into the ether. People don't notice it, but this is what they at least perceived in terms of projects. I obviously not going to make you read a whole table here, but I am highlighting for you that exposure does vary across the country, and it makes some sense. First of all, what's interesting in the first 2 columns, the yes or no exposure, is the high level that Nova Scotia and PEI say that they feel exposed either to discussions, proposals, or built projects. And that makes sense. There's a lot going on out in our part of the country. BC says they're most exposed to discussed, and look how small at 12% in terms of built Alberta is most exposed to built projects, Saskatchewan to discussions, Manitoba to built, and Ontario to discussions. New Brunswick says built, Nova Scotia says proposed, which makes sense given the conversations going on here, as well as in Newfoundland and Labrador, where there's lots of conversations about hydrogen to ammonia projects. We wanted to know why people oppose projects. Now, this is a list that I gave them because as part of my work, I was trying to understand whether or not and how much, if so, misinformation is playing or disinformation is playing in people's perspectives. And so some things are here, you'll think, what is she doing? Well, it's here for a reason. And so what comes out on top, we had another category and people were free to provide other reasons, and they did. But primarily kill birds. I would have also put bats in there, but that was my little oversight there. But I would have had, I think, a similar answer. Health risks, second. Spoiling natural landscapes affecting water quality or availability is fourth. Lowering property values is 32%, fifth. And technology doesn't work at 30%. At the bottom we have, and this came up a lot in my previous work, there is always a concern about oil spills from the mechanisms on the turbines causing cancer, which we would say is not a real thing, is I think surprisingly high, and for some segments of the population, almost 30%. But look at the age-related results. We see that if you're over 60 years of age, concerns about the top three are even stronger than it is for younger Canadians. Water availability is particularly important to the 30 to 44-year-olds. Lower property values, and tech doesn't work again for older folks. I want to talk about not in my backyard because one of the first things that I learned in my first literature review on this topic was just how critical social scientists are about the belief that not in my backyard attitudes exist. And this is just simply a summary. The NIMBYism explanation for local opposition to renewable energy and transmission projects has long been dismissed by academic researchers who argue it is simplistic, pejorative, politically inappropriate, and unhelpful as a framework to explain public attitudes toward wind facilities both before and after they are built. And so they argue in more up-to-date literature, and I would say, I'm very proud of my literature review in the paper. It's worthy of a standalone document, and we will produce it as a standalone document. They argue it's time to let it go. And so let's look at what they do think is at play when people are responding to these projects. And the question of social acceptance, of course, can apply to any project. I just happen to be interested, being a climate change person, in the energy transition and electrification and the role that renewables and transmission will play in that. And so the kind of core framework that's often cited is the pyramid, socio-political acceptance, market acceptance, and the focus that I'm bringing to this discussion is community acceptance, which you all can cope with me using the terms procedural and distributional justice, which I often describe as fairness, and you'll see it come out here, and trust. So based on the more advanced statistical work that our research assistant did, we kind of got four, and I'm not going to read all this to you. I'm going to give you the highlights, but you will have the notes after. What really comes out on top as driving support for wind in particular, transmission is a little more complicated, is in fact the interpersonal and intergenerational distributional issues or fairness. They're strong predictors of support for wind and transmission. If you believe, and this is the interpersonal dynamic, if you believe you will not be worse off compared to others as a result of projects, and you believe that nature, the environment, and future generations will be protected, so that's the intergenerational fairness dimension, you consistently support projects. If you are concerned about the negative effect of projects on your personal financial situation, that increases your opposition. And community benefits can help counter that, particularly with people who have softer support. And unfortunately for us, I think, and those who are proponents of progress or change or transition, the kinds of community benefits that are normally offered are not the kind of community benefits that people want. They want to have their power bills reduced. They want some benefit to their property taxes. Land lease payments can also be helpful, but these are important. These three dynamics, these interpersonal dynamics, as well as the environmental benefits, really have an impact. What's interesting is that despite those, in terms of the modeling, age stands on its own. So older Canadians tend to be even more concerned. And in fact, we know this on the ground that opposition is often led by older folks. And then we also tested in the model the effects of particular narratives. And if you pay attention to Ember or IEA, they talk, IEA calls it the age of electricity, and Ember calls it the electrotech revolution. We tested a narrative like that, and what we found was that it had a positive effect on support, and that together these dynamics were important. So let me just quickly, in case you haven't seen this particular framework on fairness, I tend to like to think about it this way now that I've learned so much more about it. It's not just in the box, out of the box, fair, not fair. It is important to think about so that we're not talking past each other, the interpersonal, and intergenerational aspects that people may be concerned about, whether they're looking at comparisons to themselves, like being financially worse off, comparing themselves to others' outcomes, being worse off than others. Let's say your neighbor got a lease payment and you didn't. We've seen those jealousies hurt things. We've seen also comparisons to outcomes across groups, so much more altruistic concern, concerned about, is everybody going to be affected the same? Is it proportional to income? What happens to low-income households? Is it proportional to the contribution, in this case, to a problem? It could be to the solution. And then the environmental piece that I mentioned. Just a little bit of definitions on community benefits, which is really the distributional side of the story. So we know there can be agreements between whether it's municipal governments or between groups and communities, between householders and landowners and that kind of thing. There can be funds that are seeded by a developer. There can be funds that are created perhaps through property tax revenue, but there can also be, less on the legally binding side, plans, and they're all important to the story. And plans are important because they can actually help you set out your principles and how you intend to operate as a proponent. So when we laid out within the broad literature of what kind of community benefits are available, this is how they ranked. And again, I'll reinforce the point, these are not the ones that are usually offered. Given the concerns about cost of living, number one, people want power bill reductions. This speaks, I think, to the need for more policy work on the ratepayer versus taxpayer funded dynamics of energy transition. Obviously, the environmental piece has come up. It's important. They want to see those benefits there. If you've seen any of the meta-analysis on acceptance of policies like climate policies, three things matter: fairness, effectiveness, and trust. And we're going to come to trust. Property tax reductions are important, job training. And then the ones that are usually on offer, not to say they're not important, but they're at the bottom of the scale. These are the 8 that we tested: community infrastructure projects, social infrastructure, land lease, and joint ownership. So let me just quickly summarize how I think the story comes together, and where I feel that we need to pay more attention. So from the get-go, the engagement process is fundamental. But we need to be motivated to build relationships, and for developers and regulators to ensure that we are good neighbors for the long term. There's a good literature now on the errors or the failure to consider context, sense of place. Locations are more than just a good wind site or transmission corridor. There are places where people have grown up, they have memories, they've had traumas, they had love. Newfoundland, Labrador, the cod fishery has a huge influence how they interpret, for example, project proposals. We need more what I call radical transparency. Developers and government regulators need to really defend and be seen to be accountable and transparent. And the idea of citizen participation is not just important, but there has to be the ability to influence outcomes, access to information, and in particular, finding a way for us to get more neutral sources of information into the hands of citizens who are concerned. They're not going to trust the developers. I've been saying to people in my presentations that more than anything, more than building that project, you've got to get up every day and go to work committed to building trust. And trust has two dimensions, which I'll show you. A general trust, you often call political trust or institutional trust, and skepticism. Skepticism dampens trust. General trust can be important. You don't want too much skepticism. You don't want too much general trust. They can undermine participation, but I'll come back to that. And then we need the benefits, the commitment to protection of nature, as I've said, community benefit plans and agreements, the household and neighbor benefits, low income protections, and particularly for people living closest to projects, and the community partnerships that we are seeing with Indigenous communities also need to be extended to equity opportunities, cooperatives, municipal projects, and so on. So let me just give you just a flyby on why I think we need to get smarter about what trust is. This is a reflection of important work by Portinga and Pigeon in 2003. I've used his scale for a long time, and it's so helpful. And so when people are thinking about trust in this general trust component, you've got to be seen to be competent, to be acting with care, to make decisions that are fair, to be open. This is where that transparency and accountability piece, to values need to be in alignment, if you will, and you need to be regulating risk in ways that are trusted. And you want to minimize not being credible, so being seen to distort facts or unreliable, changing policies with no good reason. And you want to be seen to be acting with integrity. So this is a complicated story on trust, and it all matters. And the reason I care about trust is because low trust environments are breeding grounds for misinformation and disinformation. And this is from the American Psychological Association. It's a very good paper, peer-reviewed with Vander Linden, and it gives us some very good insights about how to handle it. My main point here is in these projects and in this energy transition work, everybody's got to get up every day wanting to build trust, but also to counter misinformation. I'm not going to tell you too much about this. This is going to be released soon, but this is just a representation of the 5 Canadas. And we have some very interesting results in terms of energy and the transition. You can imagine progressive activists are very keen to see it happen. So are civic nationals, but they are particularly concerned about the health effects, water effects, and household effects. Populist conservatives, less so, but we can increase their support through community benefits that target the household. So let me just summarize some recommendations here. We need to be consistently telling the story of why. This came up a lot in the focus groups. People don't understand why the energy transition is happening. What does it mean? What does it mean for my community, for me? How am I participating in it? Does it make the system more reliable, more affordable? I'm concerned that our claims on affordability are more a frame than a reality. And I think that will undermine progress if we don't get serious about it. And I come back to my point on ratepayers shouldn't be bearing the full load here. We need to really do better on community benefits and the broader palette of options available. We need to tell people that their contribution by hosting a project, what does it do to system reliability and resilience, cost control, how it helps electrify the economy. And as I've said, we need to be the exemplars of unbiased, transparent, accountable, and fair dealing behaviors and communications. We need some sort of best-in-class understanding of what community benefits are, how they should be deployed. We don't have really any guides that I've been able to find. There's some internationally, which we cite, but we need to do better here in Canada. And again, we need to avoid overhyping projects. I'm very concerned about it. Both with Wind West, the hydrogen ammonia piece, undermining trust is what happens when we overhype projects. And then finally, we do need to advance new research, I think, that actually addresses the concerns of Canadians. What are our best options? What are the international examples that are used to ensure a fair and affordable balance between ratepayer and taxpayer funded? What do we do in terms of meeting the material needs of Canadians? How do we minimize or lower costs? People in focus groups were open in saying, we'll take like just no big new increases, but they need to know somebody's helping to think about them. We need to, I think, deploy, as I said, a broader range of community benefits, and that includes on the equity side, and we need to remove barriers to municipal equity projects or community cooperatives, that kind of thing. One of the things I haven't highlighted here that came up over and over again is that people resist projects if they're primarily for export. They want to see the needs of the local, regional, national needs met first. And so we need to sort that out. A lot of projects are promoted for exports, and that's going to get us in trouble. And so that's why I say we need to have maybe a mix of the larger and smaller, more virtual power networks, more of the energy democracy local projects, as well as the large industrial scale. I've just let you know that we've identified 5 audiences. I'm not going to take you through all this, but regulators, municipal governments, developers, community groups, and communications and public engagement professionals. And I've got 10 in our report recommendations for all of those. And so I'm just going to go here and show you that in the final page, I have a link to the social acceptance report. It's not yet officially released, but if you want to go through that, if you're the kind of person who can handle a 170-page document, you're my kind of person. Climate change report is there, as well as the webinar from last week. And I'm not going to get into the words matter. If you want to talk about some of the narratives, we can do that, but I have limited time today. So if you want to talk narratives, we tested them. I have lots to say, but you'll see it in the report. All right, over to you, Omri.
Well, thank you so much, Louise, for that presentation. I think that I speak on behalf of all of us when I just thank you for the generosity of this work. It's really, it stands out in terms of its practical application, and it's tools we can use, whether we're climate communicators or proponents or people in government looking to find the best way to sort of advocate for policies that are employed. So I really thank you on that. And I think just on a more personal level, I really look to you for inspiration as someone who combines a sense of sort of a can-do attitude, but also an experience that matches that. And that's rare, I think, in the climate space, of someone who both has the experience over the last 30 years of your work to draw on, but then also has an understanding that we still haven't tried everything. And there are a lot of ways that we can advocate that haven't yet been explored. I'm just gonna now turn it over towards, and I'm also impressed at your how short your presentation was, because we had some extra time for you, but hopefully we can get into some Q&A after I ask a few questions to sort of start us off. So one of the main things that I noticed in the report, which I've gotten a chance to read, as well as the presentation, is that there is still a huge amount of support for this green transition from Canadians writ large. And I think BC is actually doing a pretty good job, or at least public opinion is showing that we're near to Atlantic Canada in terms of willingness to adopt these technologies. So given that 70% of Canadians feel pride in becoming a renewable energy superpower, yet support for onshore wind drops to 60%, and or 42% even when proposed near where you live. What mechanisms can bridge this proximity gap to ensure national pride around green energy translates to local context?
Yep. So I mean, the literature does talk about a U curve, right? Where support is higher in the abstract, and then falls when it's getting to a more specific, as people evaluate and experience the most uncertainty. And then it goes up again, potentially goes up again when you're living with the project. And a lot of the things you were worried about didn't necessarily happen. And we certainly saw that in the Ontario focus groups. It's like, oh, that stuff we were worried about with health effects, none of that happened, that kind of thing. But it all does depend on how you engage. And so all of the things that I talked about in terms of the engagement and the context and the relationship building and the need to build trust and then the need to really be responsive in terms of the kind of community benefits that people are looking for. I think allows for an opportunity for you to come out of that dip with support rising again. And we do see, in fact, that support is somewhat higher in places that say they're living with built projects. And so there is some evidence for that if you have, there is that exposure, that familiarity effect. We see it in nuclear, for example. People living near nuclear plants are more supportive than those who are not, that kind of thing. And so, knowing that there's going to be a dip, you want that dip to be minimized and you want to get out of that dip well, and you want to maintain a good relationship all the way through to decommissioning. And so, what I call in the paper is, we've barely opened the toolbox for how to execute these projects. And so it shouldn't surprise us that as you move from the general to the specific, your evaluations and your uncertainty has, more limits on your support. It doesn't disappear, but it's up to us to support that recovery process.
That's very interesting because it really turns on its head this carte blanche, or this sort of like one size fits all notion of NIMBYism. Um, and I guess I think of the work of Chad Walker a little bit, done a lot around, he assessed, the sort of populist moment that brought Doug Ford into power in Ontario
Yeah.
in his effort to sort of show how wind energy was this imposition on that population. And I guess his work also has a lot to do with Nova Scotia, and he compared Nova Scotia to Ontario in the sense of this sort of nonpartisan support for green energy. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on that. Otherwise, I'll just go into a specific question about.
I do indeed. First of all, Chad was a reviewer of my paper because I have so much respect for him. He did indeed do his PhD looking at the case of Ontario and Nova Scotia. It is cited in the paper in the literature review section. And what he found is, in fact, very much underpins why I'm talking about the need to think about the big and the small. What he felt was mostly behind the difference in reaction from Ontario residents versus Nova Scotian residents to in this case, onshore projects, was that it was, and I was in Ontario at the time. I was actually on the Ontario Power Authority board when the Green Energy Act was implemented. And what a disaster it was. It was top down. It was very much, in fact, let's run over those NIMBYs attitude, and it hurt them and still hurts them. The legacy of the McGuinty years in Ontario were shockingly present in my focus groups. In Nova Scotia, though, they tried other aspects, other approaches, including the ComFit program, and they have, I'm going to mess it up, but it's CVIP, DIP, something. But it's basically a way to invest in projects, get a tax break. And both of those programs supported smaller scale projects. And he believes that the bottom up versus the top down approach in Ontario versus Nova Scotia is one of the reasons behind the more positive attitude in Nova Scotia versus Ontario. On the question of NIMBY, I mean, I have a good section in there. What's interesting is each of the sections in the lit review is short, but literally represents significant review of papers. On the NIMBY question, what they identify is it's actually extremely rare. What it identifies is this idea of kind of a selfish interest. Now, you might say, well, your results show that people are concerned about, the personal benefits. But often what's happening, yes, that's true. Cost of living is a real concern, but it's not necessarily, it's what drives opposition, but not support. And one of the key things that really came out of the literature review was we should spend more time promoting and highlighting and front showing the level of support and building support, not trying to counter opposition. And it's like illuminating, when you think about it that way. Well, of course, but that's not what we've been doing. We try to counter opposition. And instead, they're saying, no, 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 don't bother with that. Show the support that there is, do a baseline survey in a community before you start a project. And then, build on that over time, work with supporters, help build people and help them find a way to say yes. If you want to reduce opposition, trust building, misinformation is key to it, and meeting their particular set of needs around their personal financial concerns. They're likely older, they may be lower income. There's maybe reasons why this is an issue. They may have moved to this community because they think it should stay the way it is. You often see research showing the difference between, people who've lived in communities for generations versus new arrivals. There's differences there. And so there's lots going on, when people oppose. And so I think the literature is clear that simplistic, throw it at them, not in my backyard attitude arguments is just not helpful. It's complex and there's a lot more going on.
Thanks for that answer. Yeah, I think I also have a soft spot for Nova Scotia because I'm originally from there. But it is really impressive just with that sort of cross-partisan acceptance because of this work you're talking about. And as someone who does communications and who's sort of trained in that, it's an interesting tactic to not just control the message 100%, but to sort of be on the journey with people and build trust. I also have a question also related to Nova Scotia. Just you show how power bill reductions and property tax reductions are the most highly valued community benefits in the survey that was conducted. Do you recommend that provincial procurement processes like the one in Nova Scotia mandate that these specific household level financial offsets are a condition for project approval?
Yeah, I'm not. I'm not sure if that is the precise mechanism. I really do feel that we need thoughtful minds to actually work on this issue. Right now, the way I understood it, at least described to me by developers in Nova Scotia, is a few things happen. One is there's a set rate that it's not uncommon. You see it in UK, other countries, and also Nova Scotia, that require per megawatt a certain amount of property taxes to be paid, for example. So that's a requirement. In the current request for proposals that's out in Nova Scotia, I was told that, in fact, the point structure for projects is higher for social acceptance than it is for price at the moment. Now, I could see that could change over time as folks figure out what they're doing. But what it has driven in terms of Nova Scotia is that developers are actually negotiating community benefits agreements before they do their bid. They've already sat down with a community group or a municipality or created a community liaison group, that kind of thing, looked at job training opportunities, identified their equity partners, all of that in the bid. And so I think that's a part of it. But I also think we need far more attention to this particular question of how do we actually control what's happening on the power bill side and on property tax side. So, if you follow California at all, when CARB is looking at the cap and trade system revenue, they publish to the penny where all the money goes. And I think we actually need municipal governments to do that for what's happening to the property tax revenue, how it's helping build out infrastructure in their communities, maybe social and environmental benefits, and particularly what it's doing on the property tax side. On the power bill side, I mean, we're starting to see some interesting things. The UK in their last budget just removed the renewable energy obligation cost from the power bills. Australia is offering free power for 3 hours a day. There's got to be somebody who can do the analysis of what the best approaches are here, other than my broad argument that given the benefits of energy transition in terms of socialized benefits, environmental benefits, that there's an argument to be made here that this is not a ratepayer funded endeavor. And so is it something that's required in the bids? I'm not sure yet, Omri. I think it's maybe a bit bigger, but I know there are folks who know electricity better than I may that, I hope would be putting their minds to it. The reason I'm harping on it is that the colleagues that I know and care about deeply are not putting their minds to it. And I'm finding a bit of resistance. When I say it, it's like, well, that's not possible. Well, I'm sorry, but it better be possible. You better figure it out.
Mhm. Yeah, well, I think that, my original comment around this work being very generous is that it's generating a lot of potential for other work that needs to be done to make these policies
Yeah,
possible. I know here in BC, we're looking into our version of virtual net metering, and then the procurement process, the request for proposal process, the calls for power from BC Hydro are also up, but they are unfortunately prioritizing mostly cost effectiveness for
exactly.
customers as well as
Exactly. Which is a
ability.
legislative issue, right?
Yeah,
Energy Utilities Board, it's an economic agency. Nova Scotia has broadened the mandate to include sustainability. We're fighting for that in New Brunswick, but yeah, these are economic agencies, and I mean, it's just silly. But I also think that the Federal Major Projects Office could be doing more to require, if you want access to the Infrastructure Bank or the Canada Growth Fund, we need to see some best practice on these fronts. I think they could be doing a lot more to help. But instead, they're creating the frame of we're too much in a rush. It's all got to be hurried up, and we don't have time for this. And I think that's going to hurt us in the long run.
definitely something you want to plan out. I just have one more sort of question, and then we can turn it over to the audience. The polling that you did, as well as previous ones, show that university educated urban people appear to be more supportive of renewables. This aligns with common tropes around renewables and especially wind being an urban imposition on rural people. As we mentioned, this demographic split has been used by numerous politicians like Doug Ford or Danielle Smith to gain populist appeal. This is in addition to what are called subsidized publics or, groups that are sort of put forward as representing the entirety of a public opinion or a demographic. So, what sort of recommendations do you have for green energy proponents to be able to curb this dynamic on a case by case basis?
Well, let me just kind of pull out a couple of pieces around the rural aspect of it. Rural Canadians in our study are most exposed to projects. That makes sense. We're not building huge turbines in downtown Toronto. And so my kind of challenge to this is, sure, there may be folks playing politics with it, but the reality is there is a lot of support among rural Canadians for projects. It may be somewhat lower than the more abstract support you get in urban environments, but there is support, and they've been clear about what they need. They are concerned about household costs, but also they score higher than other residential types for job training. And so I think part of the issue is we have not really truly met the needs and legitimately listened to folks. So, for example, while rural folks may also be higher to some degree in opposing projects, they also are more concerned about the landscape effects and the effects on birds and so on. And so everything I said in terms of the concerns and the needs that need to be addressed, you may see that there's, greater, support in other community types, but I would not say there's no statistical difference, let me just say, between university education and living in rural environments. And so while university educated urban environments may come up higher, frankly, I take the opinion of the rural folks more seriously. I'm more concerned about whether their needs are being met, and that we are legitimately addressing those. It is also the case, as I mentioned, that people who are more exposed tend to be more supportive. And so you want to think about the fact that rural Canadians are older, and so they have a particular set of issues that may need to be addressed. It fits with the economics to some degree, but they also have strong neighborly concerns. For example, John Parkins in Alberta found that, in fact, support for projects was tied to whether or not neighbors were harmed in any way. So there's an altruism at play, not just a selfishness that I think we fail to appreciate.
And I think just to sort of name it, you didn't go into it in your presentation, but your previous report talked a lot about civic nationals. And I just wonder if you wanted to sort of like do a quick definition of that
Sure.
before we go in.
Yeah, sure. So we've got these five kind of Canadas that has emerged from research that we started with Eric LaChapelle at the University of Montreal, who does this work for a network called Eco Analytics. And I got to tell you, the draw. Well, first of all, there's kind of I've used a short battery, 7 questions. They include 5 climate change related questions and 4 climate questions and 3 social values questions. And man, this stuff works. The differences in population segments are always 99%. Like it's crazy. Like it's crazy. Every result is 0.001. So there's something, he's onto something. And the progressive activist will be obviously something you can figure out just by the name. And is always the most concerned about climate change, tends to be urban and more university educated and so on. But civic nationals, this almost 1/3 of the population, what a cool group. So it's been very illuminating for all of us because they are very concerned about climate change, but very conservative in their values, whereas your progressive activist is very progressive in their values. And so, for example, very concerned about immigration right now, very concerned about equity, having gone too far with equity, very concerned about government interference. And these folks are very engaged in their communities. And if you know anything about my climate plan and the work of Jamie Bigger and Adam Linsford, they are working very closely with civic nationals and found in the last election, if you ask them to do something like take 5 people with you to vote or whatever, have a conversation with 5 people, they do it. Whereas progressive activists tend not to be that way. And so civic nationals are wonderful, but different, more conservative, and you get to them through nature, gardening, birding, hiking, camping. It's a whole different way of engaging. They're my people in my rural environment. I live outside of Fredericton. I'm a homesteader. I farm and we have a woodlot, and these are my people. These are the farmers up the road, that kind of thing. And so it's important to consider civic nationals and to engage with them. They need a different pathway. They are very concerned about their household costs. And I worry a little bit about civic nationals and seeing them being exposed to, if you saw my climate work from last week, and if you look at the links, you'll see that thinking climate change is exaggerated or a hoax is increasing. Civic nationals seem to be a little bit vulnerable to that. They're also vulnerable to thinking wind projects cause cancer. 28% of civic nationals relative to 20% nationally. And so this is a very important group to engage and to take seriously and to meet the needs of, and back to meeting the material needs of Canadians. Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks. And this is all available on the Re.Climate website, FYI. We just have a question from Roger Bryanton, and please put up your hand if you've got a subsequent one. But he's asking, how were people for the survey selected?
For the survey?
Yeah,
Yeah. So these are, you've known anything about the pollsters these days. We don't do mail surveys anymore. We don't do phone. And so what they use are these very large panels, like 500,000 people in a panel that are recruited from many different ways. And people are invited to complete surveys, and they do. You're only allowed to complete maybe 2 or 3 surveys, and then there's lots of rotation, lots of new people. And of course, lots of people had concerns about this idea of using these panels for surveys. But the large size and the random selection, if you will, when you're within that large sample, have been shown to be relatively representative as I've seen it. Nobody questions when David Coletto puts out his results on, vote intention or anything like that. And we're very careful, right? We do large samples. We obviously report significant results. I like to look at whether what are my results weighting and non-weighting. I tend to have quotas for province, and I'll tell you why, because pollsters, if you let them get away with it, would give me nothing useful in the Atlantic. They tend to want to collapse the Atlantic results, which is infuriating because I can tell you right now, a PEIer is not a Nova Scotia person and is not a New Brunswicker. They are very different. Newfoundland, Labrador, again. So I try to get at least an oversample in the Atlantic provinces, so I have something I can actually analyze. Yeah, that I think is, reasonably credible. I'm also pretty careful. I don't go running around saying Canadians this, Canadian that a lot. Although I did use weighting in this one because, and I did check the before and after this differences are minimal, because Abacus weighted everything, and I'm trying to make sure my numbers don't look so different when I do my own analysis to theirs. And so I did use weighting this time, but I tend to be cautious. Yeah.
Hmm. That sounds extremely robust and something that can be reproduced. Okay, so I've got a question here from Laura O'Doherty, and if anyone is online and I'm reading out your question and I'm butchering it, please just intervene. But I'll go ahead and say that she's very much appreciative of the presentation and is working on a project where they're conducting cross-sectoral content analysis of community benefit agreements and related benefit sharing agreements to examine how agreements vary across benefit types,
Yes.
governance arrangements,
Yeah.
enforcement mechanisms, and community participation. And they've identified 5 databases. She goes into it. And I would
Okay.
love to know, or she would love to know, if there are any other databases we should look into. I guess I'll read out the databases. SFU, Sabine Center, WRI, Columbia Center, U.S. Department of Energy. Also, will we be provided with the links for the PowerPoint at the end of this presentation?
Yep, everything's there, and I will PDF I'll take out some of the slides that weren't relevant here and send it to Omri, and he'll send it to you. And then that last slide includes the links to the main report and my climate work from last week. So Laura, please reach out. I want to talk to you more. When we release the report on March 26th, I'm thinking it would be nice to have a developer on the panel, a researcher, maybe Chad. It sounds like maybe we need you. So reach out. That would be super. I'm not aware of all the databases. It was already overwhelming, and so I have a lot to learn. I don't feel I've even scratched the surface of what there is to know here. So I welcome more engagement and sharing, and yeah, educate me. It'd be great.
Amazing. Okay, that's great. I'm glad this webinar served for that. Emily Wordley has a question, again, very complimentary to the presentation. And she's wondering whether you had researched the impact of power dynamics within planning processes on perceptions towards energy projects.
Yes. Okay. Yes. So the procedural fairness questions. Um, Yes, I mean this particular one was more focused on the distributional aspects and not so much on the procedural aspects. It's covered well in the literature review. Um, I know for sure in the research I did, I looked at 4 cases in New Brunswick. Obviously, the power dynamics really do have an effect. And that's why I'm calling for so much more support. If you look at the recommendations in the report and in the deck, one of the things I call for is the creation of either an ombudsman or some sort of neutral source of information where citizens can go and that can ask questions. Like, is what we're being offered appropriate? Is it best in class? Is it relative to what others should be getting? Like, people have so many questions, but even worse, citizens are not educated generally speaking, to be ready to evaluate an entire 400-page environmental impact assessment. Rarely is a social impact assessment done, which is really what people are concerned about. And so they need some support, and it can't be funded by developers because they don't trust that. So I think we need a lot more infrastructure. I don't know the ins and outs. I'm not an expert, in terms of the developer world or some of the research that you all may be familiar with, but I know that's a problem and I know that it's an issue. This issue of structural barriers, I also think is critically important. So, for example, many projects are not even announced until after a power purchase agreement has been negotiated with the utility. And that is often well after, projects the site's been decided, there may be some lease agreements already in place, and then all of a sudden the broader community hears about it for the first time. That is a power dynamic that is just terrible. The other power dynamic is neighbors being treated differently than other neighbors. And so, neighbor agreements, neighbor benefits that are extending beyond whether or not a project is on your land or not. This question of benefits being distributed fairly within the community, we often see in the literature people prefer a more social distribution as opposed to an individual distribution. I mean, what is the right balance for all of that? All of those things are power dynamics to some degree. And certainly in New Brunswick, in the two case studies I looked at, the jealousies that were generated from that in unequal access to information and benefits created terrible jealousies. I mean, people were crying in their interviews with us. It was just really too much. And is that a community that's going to be ready for a new project proposal? I think not. I think not.
Yeah. Well, I think a whole other question really is about Indigenous participation in these energy projects. That's a big thing here in BC. And I wonder whether you have any insights on that, on First
I can
Nations.
share with you that it's creating jealousy. And I see a comment on the narratives, and so I'll quickly speak to that before we close.
Yeah, please.
So it came up several times in my interviews for this research that that people feel there's an it's an unfair advantage to Indigenous communities. I can be honest with you to say that developers were they admitted to me that this is not about reconciliation. This is about expedience. This means that two things happen: expedience because they think it makes projects go faster, and second, because they know people won't have the courage to oppose a project if there's Indigenous partnership. Those dynamics are going to hurt us in the long run. We need Indigenous partnerships, obviously, but other partnerships should also be possible. Municipal partnerships, cooperatives, different scales, large, small. If we don't work on that, I think in the end we'll have some challenges. And I was surprised that it was already coming out in a lot of the interviews that I was having, that this is a dynamic that's going to be a concern in the long run.
Mm.
Let me
Well,
just quickly say on the narratives, I tested 5 narratives. I could have spent half an hour talking to you about that, and I was a bit nervous about it. They are in the reports. I looked at the Mark Carney narrative, Time to Build, got all that, which I wrote in a more renewable energy frame. I did one called Pollution Blanket that actually uses an explanation of how climate change works. I did one using net zero and our bureaucratic language. I wouldn't say to use that. It's not that effective unless you are an energy province. It worked in Alberta. It worked in Newfoundland, for example. The pollution blanket, it works in Alberta because it wasn't identity triggering. Time to Build was very popular in a lot of provinces, but not every province. I also tested the electrotech kind of frame that we've been doing. I tested 4 parts of an electrotech frame. And what we found was talking about the inevitability of the transition, oil and gas is over, that kind of talk that we do is undermining support, that people were more interested in future-oriented framing, talking about generational opportunities and careers. Like you see that in the current government's framing, although they cover the whole gambit, and I'm looking at renewables. So words matter. They had a big effect, and it's all there for you to look at.
Well, of course, I'm with everyone else here when I just want to thank you again for that amazing presentation and your willingness to answer all of these questions, and for your far-sighted words that will be staying with us. And I encourage people to subscribe to Re.Climate because you'll get the updates for all these reports that are going to be coming out over the coming months. Um, I also just want to thank the Willow Grove Foundation and RAFDC for funding our work, and thank everyone for your participation. Our next presentation through CERG is coming up on March 19th, and it's Lessons from Failure, the Inflation Reduction Act, and that's being or the presentation is by Andy Hira, who of course is the director for our organization, and he'll be in conversation with Mitchell Beer, who's the founding publisher of the Energy Mix, and Jay Mather, who's the CEO of the Carbon Free Group. And another quick announcement is that the BC Sustainable Energy Association is hosting a conference called Energy Connections 2026, and that's going to be on April 27th. So look into all of those things, and thanks everyone for being here, and looking forward to more to come. Yeah.
Great. Thanks for joining. And Roger, I will indeed, I rarely travel far distances, but I will be in BC from June 21st to July 9th. So reach out if you want me to do a presentation.
Yeah, and
Okay.
reach out to me as well because I'd love to
Okay.
participate.
Okay, great. Take care, everybody. Bye.
All the best. See
Bye.
you.